Welcome back to episode 3 of Jesus, Dead or Alive? The Matter of Miracles. Another popular approach is to say that Jesus never came back from the dead, as this would be a miracle, and miracles don't happen. The 18th century skeptic David Hume took this line. He said that even if all credible historians agreed that on January 1, 1600, Queen Elizabeth died and was buried, but a month later reappeared, resumed the throne, and ruled England for another 3 years, he would not believe it. He would assume there must be some other explanation. He once said that the only true miracle was that anybody should believe in them. This is a clever soundbite, but is it correct? The Chambers Dictionary describes a miracle as an event or act which breaks a law of nature. And for many people, this ends the argument. There is nothing beyond the laws of nature, and as the resurrection of Jesus would have involved a miracle, it clearly never happened. If this is so, not only is the resurrection of Jesus ruled out, but the entire Bible self-destructs, because it records well over 200 miracles. Yet this approach makes no sense, because it decides the case before examining it. Any honest assessment of an alleged miracle should begin not by rejecting it out of hand, but by looking into the evidence. If this points to a miracle, it demands an explanation beyond the normal laws of nature. Refusing to consider this is neither sensible nor honest. The fact is that the laws of nature cannot cause anything to happen. They merely reflect our assessment of how things normally happen. The person who believes in God goes further and says they describe what God normally causes to happen. If God exists and determines the laws of nature, he can override or alter them whenever he chooses. And if he created the entire universe and governs all the laws by which it operates, bringing a dead person back to life would hardly be a problem for him. This lies behind a statement made by 13 prominent scientists, mostly of them university professors, in a letter to the Times in 1984. It is not logically valid to use science as an argument against miracles. To believe that miracles cannot happen is as much an act of faith as to believe that they can happen. It is important to affirm that science, based as it is on observance of precedents, can have nothing to say on the subject. Rejecting the resurrection of Jesus because it would have meant a miracle makes no scientific case. Miracles are not against nature, they are above nature. And to deny their possibility is ignorance masquerading as intelligence. The right approach to any proposed miracle is to set aside all our prejudices and to ask the straightforward, open-minded question, did it happen? In the case of the resurrection of Jesus, several interesting alternatives have been put forward. Near-death experiences. There has always been fascinated interest in what have become known as near-death experiences, or NDEs, and some people have supposed that this is what took place in the case of Jesus. Early in the 18th century, theologian Heinrich Paulus suggested that Jesus fell into a coma on the cross, and later, in the cool of the tomb, revived sufficiently to make his way out and then deceive the disciples that he had come back from the dead. Sometime later, another theologian, Karl Friedrich Barth, claimed that Jesus pretended to be dead, using drugs supplied by the physician Luke, but later was resuscitated by one of his followers. Also in the 18th century, yet another theologian, Carl Venturini, put forward the idea that a group of supporters, members with Jesus of a secret society, went to the tomb dressed in white, heard Jesus groaning inside, scared the guards away, then rescued their friend. These are variations of the so-called swoon theory, but the physical ordeals that Jesus endured in the hours before his burial are sufficient to rule it out. Firstly, Pilate had Jesus beaten and scourged, Matthew 27:26. The scourge was a short whip with several leather strips loaded with pieces of metal or glass, or small metal balls. The victim was tied in a bent position, exposing his back to the maximum effect, while the lashes rained on him. The punishment was so vicious that it tore chunks out of his body. Sometimes the victim's back muscles would be so badly shredded that the underlying bones were exposed. The scourge could even whip around to the front of the victim's head, and tear out his eyes. Some victims were literally scourged to death. In the case of Jesus, the loss of blood was made worse by a crown of thorns, Matthew 27:29. The thorns being jammed onto his head before he was led away to crucifixion. Exact details of the crucifixion vary, but essentially the victim was stripped naked and his wrists or hands nailed to the crossbeam, which was then secured to an upright pole in the ground. The victim's feet were then nailed to the pole, and he was left there to die of a combination of shock, blood loss, and dehydration. 2 criminals were crucified at the same time as Jesus. As the Jews did not want bodies left hanging during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the victims' legs broken to ensure that they were dead. Then their bodies be taken down. Pilate gave permission for this to be done, and the legs of the 2 other men were broken. When the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, John 19:33. Yet to be absolutely sure, one of them rammed a spear into his side, producing a flow of blood and water, John 19:34. Medical experts give 2 possible explanations for this description. When a person's heart stops beating, the blood inside the heart chambers clots fairly quickly, then separates into plasma and red blood cells. If the soldier stabbed Jesus near the heart and lungs, the spear wound would have produced these 2 fluids, which a layman might well describe as blood and water. The second explanation points out the horrific trauma Jesus suffered before and during crucifixion would almost certainly have caused a buildup of fluid in the pericardial sac surrounding the heart, as well as enlarging the heart chambers with blood. A spear piercing these organs shortly after death, before blood congealed, would have produced a flow of blood and water. Whatever the exact medical explanation, John's words ring true, and soon there was further confirmation that Jesus was dead. That evening, Joseph, a wealthy follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked permission to remove the body for burial. The Bible records what happened. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. Mark 15:44-45. Pilate was not prepared to take Joseph's word that Jesus was dead. Only when this was confirmed by the commanding officer in charge of the execution did Pilate agree to release the body. Wrapping it in linen, Joseph placed the body in the unused tomb he had reserved for his own burial, and which was carved out of rock in a nearby garden. At least 2 women, both called Mary, saw the burial take place. Then what does even the simplest of the swoon theories ask us to believe? Exhausted, traumatized, and hemorrhaging an immense amount of blood, Jesus lost consciousness while hanging on the cross for 6 hours, but remained alive even after his side had been ripped open by a soldier's spear. Then throughout the entire process of taking his body down from the cross, carrying it to the garden, wrapping it in grave clothes, and laying it in the tomb, nobody noticed the slightest suggestion that Jesus was still breathing. A stone-cold tomb was hardly an intensive care unit, yet at some time during the following 36 hours, Jesus came out of a coma, and like some first-century Houdini, wriggled out of a tightly wound shroud layered with a sticky mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 70 pounds in weight, John 19:39. He then pushed aside the massive rock blocking the entrance to the tomb, breaking the governor's seal in the process, overpowered all the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, and made his way into the city, presumably naked as the linen wrapped was left behind. By the time he met his disciples, he had made an astonishing recovery. He persuaded them not that he had returned from the brink of death and was in desperate need of medical attention, but that he had conquered death and broken through into a radiant new dimension of life. Quite apart from all the other difficulties that a swoon theory faces, the last sentence of our reconstruction would be enough to reject it out of hand. It would mean that after a lifetime in which he was without sin, Hebrews 4:15, Jesus deliberately hoodwinked his closest friends into believing a monstrous lie, knowing that if they believed him, they would be ruthlessly persecuted and eventually hounded to death. There have been more conspiracy theories about the resurrection of Jesus than about the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. Some of the Kennedy theories have a measure of credibility. The swoon theories have none.